Long-time listener, first-time writers, they say, and this happened about a year ago, and holy F. I never thought something this messed up would happen to me and my family. So it all started when my parents, both recently retired, decided to use their part of their life savings to go away on a 6-month world cruise. Not really my jam, but they were psyched about it and I was psyched for them. And even better, the lease on my apartment was up the week before they left, so I was free to house sit for them the entire time they were gone. This was a relief to my mom, who would have spent the whole cruise in a state of neurosis, calling me or my brother to check on the house every 5 minutes. And knowing that I was living there ironically meant that she wouldn't worry at all. Oh, Mother, if only you'd known. In the week before they left, as I moved my things into my old childhood bedroom ready for the next 6 months, my mom gave me the rundown of the house as if I hadn't grown up there. I barely paid attention to all the things that she was telling me. Yes, Mom, I know where the fridge is, I know the Wi-Fi password, I know how to use the TV. I know the guest room is filled with Aunt Joni's art while she's between husbands, and that I must not dispose of any of it. What I didn't know about, though, was the new neighbor. His name was Mr. Samuels, and he moved in a few months previously. If you believe my mom, Mr. Samuels was an angel sent from heaven. He was the loveliest, sweetest old person, Mom said, despite the fact that he was only a couple of years older than my dad. Now, he baked cakes for the neighbors, so I shouldn't be surprised if he dropped by with some muffins or maybe even some red velvet cake. I admit, I do like a good red velvet cake, so maybe Mr. Samuels was okay by me. Mr. Samuels had a nurse who came by every other day, so I didn't need to worry about him apparently, not that I'd been planning to. Mom did enough worrying for the whole family. I didn't actually see Mr. Samuels before my parents left for their cruise because he was away staying with one of his kids. And so I bid my parents farewell at the docks, waving a handkerchief and sobbing like a wartime bride. Not really, but then headed back to the house, ready for 6 months of hardcore freelance art commissions and watching all the subscription services that my parents subscribed to and I didn't want to pay for. Mr. Samuels returned home a few days into my newfound alone time. And imagine my absolute surprise when the gentle Mr. Rogers-esque fella that I pictured was absolutely nothing like that at all. Mr. Samuels may have been 75 years old, but he was the kind of 75 that looked ex-Navy SEAL, and in fact was, and who probably had a home gym, and he did, and he was a muscular, confidently spoken, weirdly charming man, and at first I wondered why he needed a regular nurse, and then, when I first saw the nurse show up for his first appointment, I remember that my mother can be rather naive sometimes. Let's just say that she was the kind of nurse who is paid good money to relieve someone's tension via massage, and just leave it at that. But hey, the man was single, and just because he was old, it didn't mean that he didn't have needs. And every other day at 75? Damn, I was almost in awe. Now, he did bake a very good red velvet cake, and one of his first acts as a welcome gift was to bring a cake over and introduce himself. I'll admit, while he was charming, he also made my skin crawl. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and this 75-year-old man, who looked like he could easily overpower me without a moment's thought, was very clearly trying to rizz me up, as the kids say. And I usually hate the phrase undressing me with his eyes, but there was no better way to describe it here. And Mr. Samuels made no secret of it. He'd make remarks like, Gladys never said her daughter was so cute, or how he'd wish that he'd known my mom when she was my age, things like that. It would have been flattering if it wasn't so intense, and he wasn't quite so, I don't know how to describe it, but he had this aura where it was obvious that he wanted me to know that he could take me. And I've known guys like this since high school, but never once was he ever twice my age. And he wasn't so much a silver fox as a white wolf, and once I got that image in my head, I couldn't shake it. Thankfully, I didn't have many dealings with Mr. Samuels outside of him bringing over baked goods, and in the end, as much as it hurts me to have to do so, I ended up tossing them out because I was becoming paranoid that he might be slipping something into the baking. I'd watched an Instagram short about a predator who did some fairly gross stuff like that, and I got it inside my own head about it a little. Looking back, I am pretty grateful that I didn't risk it. And so after a month of catching up on art commissions and emailing editors begging for work, I began to go a little stir-crazy. Surprisingly, Mom didn't call anywhere near as much as I expected, and I found myself missing my goofy parents a lot. We had a few Zoom calls, but the internet on the cruise ship wasn't exactly reliable, and so half of the time it was like watching my folks in stop motion while Mom yelled, "What was that? What did you say, Sel?" over and over, as my name is Celeste, but she calls me Sel. I decided to surprise my parents by giving the house a little bit of a decluttering, or at least the parts that I knew that I was allowed to touch. Aunt Joni's paintings could stay, but I knew that the attic was an absolute crap show of disorganization. Plus, I figured that I'd find a bunch of fun childhood memories up there, and maybe some stuff that was worth a bit of money. I remember my brother having a bunch of old consoles and action figures that surely had to be worth something, and God knows that we both could have used the money since we were both artists. I wasn't in the attic for long before I came to two realizations. One, this was going to be a mammoth job, and two, someone had cut a hole in the drywall between our attic and the adjoining one. And of course, it was Mr. Samuel's attic. Not only that, cables were snaking through the hole, followed them through the maze of boxes and old Christmas decorations, and I was horrified at what I found. Holes had been drilled into the floor, very recently by the look of the sawdust, and two wires snaked down into two rooms. Now, without going into technical details, I traced the wires to the bathroom and the bedroom that I was staying in and discovered that small cameras had been set up, hidden within fake smoke alarms. Now, following the wires back up and creeping into Mr. Samuel's attic, I found a laptop running with active feeds of both rooms. The bedroom camera was angled so you could see the whole room, and the bathroom camera was angled at the shower. And so in short, dear sweet old Mr. Samuels had literally been spying on me for God knows how long and had violated my privacy in the most diabolically disgusting way. I minimized the live feed and found a folder on the desktop marked quote-unquote best of. The contents horrified me. There were a number of videos of me showering, of me changing, and even a couple of where I was, for want of a better term, relieved some tension of being single in bed. Now, without thinking, in utter disgust, I deleted the entire folder and emptied the recycle bin, and then immediately realized the idiotic move I'd made. Subconsciously, though, I think my brain drove me to do so in order to avoid considering law enforcement, and more on that later. I wanted revenge on Samuels, but I also wanted him to live with fear of the revenge. Now, my first step was to sever the wires connecting the cameras. My second step was to head downstairs and reach out to a friend of mine who was, how do I put this, good with computers. He sent me a piece of software to install on Mr. Samuel's computer via a USB stick that would completely mess up not only his laptop, but any computer connected to the same router. Irreparably, my friend promised. Now, I should add here that I knew Samuels was out of town for a few days, supposedly visiting his daughters again. Now, who knows what he really got up to? It could have been literally anything. And he was due back the next day, so I hurried and installed the virus on his laptop via that USB stick. I followed my friend's instructions and then forced myself to leave the attic and wait a day or so for Mr. Samuels to return. And I could tell when he discovered the outcome of his deception. From his laptop speaker, a robotic voice began blaring, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids," over and over again. Above me, I could hear Samuels freaking out until he slammed that laptop shut. Then I heard his footsteps thundering down the stairs, presumably to his other main PC, and I waited and then, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids." According to my friend, there was absolutely no way to get rid of this unless you were a tech genius or whatever. Something about writing it to the root of the BIOS or something, so even a hard drive wipe and Windows reinstall wouldn't fix it. And something told me that while Mr. Samuels might be capable of setting up a pervert spy network, he wasn't capable of fixing this. I was right, because the next weekend, I saw his entire desktop PC smashed into little bits sitting out on the sidewalk for the garbage collection. Hilariously, they wouldn't take electronics, so it was just sort of left there until the HOA contacted him about the unsightly garbage, and the next day, a snapped laptop joined the pile. Now, I'm sure he suspected me because the baking delivery stopped, and he also avoided eye contact with me whenever we'd pass each other, coming and going. Now, I still felt sick that this dirty, disgusting old perv had gotten away with getting off to me at my most vulnerable, though. I kept consoling myself with the reminder that he was 75 and would be dead long before me. But then I had nightmares about how he might have sent the videos to other like-minded perverts. No matter how much I reminded myself that the low-quality, grainy pictures made my identity impossible to discern, it didn't help because Samuels could easily have doxed me. I live in fear of something else happening, but nothing else did. I confessed my fears to my friend, though, who suggested one final idea. I don't know exactly what he did, but a few days later, a smartphone arrived in the mail. My friend told me to stick it through Samuel's mailbox in the middle of the night and just leave it at that. And I asked him why and what the phone contained, but he told me it was better that I didn't know. I posted the phone. Whatever was on there had caused Samuels to become a recluse, and the rest of my house sitting went without incident. And after a while, I noticed that the nurse was no longer coming to visit Samuels. Good. And that man didn't deserve any joy in his life. And eventually my parents returned from their cruise. I didn't tell them anything about what had happened. I was honestly just too ashamed, and too worried that my dad, the mild-mannered as he was usually, would spend his remaining years in prison for killing their next-door neighbor if he knew what he'd done to his baby girl. Now, a few months after I moved out into my own place again, Mom mentioned that Mr. Samuels had been placed into an assisted living facility by his children. She said it was all very strange, like he mentally declined within the space of a year. Now, I said nothing, but I had to suppress a smile there. I don't know if I did the right thing by not calling the cops and handling everything in this very unusual way, but here's the reason. When I was in college, I was assaulted. My experience with the police was, well, as I'm sure some of you know, not so good. And I was made to feel like it was all my fault because of how I dressed and because I'd had maybe 2 drinks, because I'd been affectionate with my assailant. I know all cops aren't like that. I know that plenty of cops are sympathetic, even heroic with certain victims, but I was not one of them. And the idea of trying to convince them that my elderly neighbor was spying on me, even though realistically the evidence was all there, it just terrified me. And so maybe I handled things pretty badly. Maybe me and my friend taking justice into our own hands was an immoral decision. But honestly, knowing what that man was capable of in his 70s, I can only imagine the things that he may have done when he was younger, fitter, and more savvy at getting away with it. And knowing he's spending the last years of his life slowly losing his mind in an assisted living facility, probably being spoon-fed baby food by a tattooed male orderly who he can't sexually harass, well, honestly, I sleep at night just fine. I do still periodically check for spy cams, though, as I'm quite paranoid and you can never be too careful. So many years ago, my parents still lived in the house that I grew up in as a child. The neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Morse, stuck out to me as a kid as a regimental, stern couple. Now, Mr. Morris was the type of man you can only describe as blustering, and Mrs. Morris was sort of like a human square, with a bowl haircut and a mustache almost as bushy as her husband. Now, if this sounds like being uncharitable to them, hell yeah, I definitely am, and you'll hate these two by the end of the story as well. Unless you're a psychopath, in which case, may I suggest that you live in a cabin in the woods without neighbors. The Morrises were sternly friendly with my parents, while me and my siblings grew up. They had this son, August, who was in the Scouts with my elderly brother Barry, and he was sort of like a mini version of his father. Bossy, always demanding to be the leader of the activities, and would become quietly red-faced angry if things didn't go his way. Us kids in the neighborhood had a nickname behind his back, and that of a certain Austrian dictator that I don't think you're allowed to say on YouTube, but let's just say that he's someone that you will not see very often. Now anyway, the son isn't the point here. He was sent off to military boarding school at some point during high school, and the wild thing is that he bragged about asking to be sent there. And so we just grew up around the Morrises, who were pretty stern but polite and mostly just sort of kept to themselves. Occasionally, they'd complain if our music was too loud or if we had a barbecue that ran past 9 p.m. And if any of mine or my siblings' balls went into the neighbor's garden or over the boundary hedge, well, you could kiss that goodbye. They would return it, but they would puncture it. My dad asked them why they did this once, and they claimed that the balls always hit some sharp object in their garden, and there was nothing they could do about it. What, was their garden made of spiked pits or something? Now, eventually my brother Barry moved out for college, and then a couple of years later so did I, and then a couple of years after that, Andy moved out to go traveling. And that just left my parents and our much, much younger sibling Sammy, who was only 10 when I was 20. Now one day, my mom FaceTimed me in tears telling me that they were being taken to court by the Morrises. And when I got her to calm down and Dad joined the call, they explained that they'd received a legal letter from the neighbors explaining that our boundary hedge had been encroaching on their land for years, and that my family owed them over $400,000 in reparations for lost revenue for use of the land as expansion for an unspecified business. Now, the reason they called me first was because I was studying law at the time. Immediately, this rang a million alarm bells in my head, and I asked them what distance the hedge was supposedly encroaching on the neighbor's land, and they very meekly told me 1 inch. And I asked them to scan the letter and send it over. I did some research, called a few friends, and discovered that, much as I suspected, the law firm representing the Morrises not only was not reputable, but in fact, entirely imaginary. The Morrises had invented their own law firm and sent a fake threatening letter. And my biggest confusion was why. It was obvious that my parents wouldn't just pay $400,000 without seeking legal counsel. And the answer came a couple of days later when a second letter from the fraudulent law firm arrived. They presented an offer that the bill would be dropped if my parents would agree to shift the boundary hedge 10 feet back, granting a much larger boundary to the neighbors as a sort of cost-free compensation to avoid any monetary demands. Now, this was something that, knowing my parents, if they didn't have a daughter who was a lawyer in training, they may have agreed to that just for a quiet life. Now, I worked it out using some land blueprints and contacted the relevant offices and discovered that the Morrises had applied for an extension to their house and purchased a prefab guest house, but both projects would require them to encroach into my parents' land. And so at the time, I happened to be dating an older guy, who's now my husband, who worked for a law firm specializing in this kind of thing. And he did some digging and checked out some old records, and it turned out that the boundary hedge was in fact around a foot into my parents' property, meaning if anything, the Morrises had been encroaching on our land this entire time. My boyfriend drafted an actual legitimate legal document stating this with the relevant proof, and the letter ended with a confirmation that my family was simply letting things be as long as the Morrises did the same to avoid any kind of escalation. We hoped that being caught red-handed would cause these fools to drop their lies. Clearly, we underestimated just how badly they wanted their extension, or how much money they dropped on this back garden prefab, presumably non-refundable. However, their next move didn't take the form of fake lawyers or legal threats at all. Instead, my parents started receiving notes written like ransom letters, with the letters cut out of various magazines. I'm not joking. They made strange, bizarre threats, such as a promise to kill our pet miniature donkey, something we never even owned, and another letter threatened to poison the koi in our pond. We don't have a pond or koi. The letters were so ridiculous that my parents kept copies, but didn't report them to the police, not at first. But then they became threatening. My parents wouldn't show me the notes directly, but they let slip that the notes names myself and my brothers, and then finally, a note arrived promising that Sammy would never arrive home from school one day when they least expected it, which is when they finally went to the cops. And of course, the cops couldn't prove that the notes came from the Morrises. This harassment went on for 5 years. Acts of petty vandalism, weird pieces of graffiti on the walls of the house, hoses were clipped in the middle of the night with the faucet running so the yard flooded, dead birds and roadkill being left on the doorstep, and the Morrises, these clever idiots, obviously made themselves the victims of their own harassment too, so suspicion didn't fall on them. And then the fire started. Just small, contained fires in the backyard that scorched the lawn. Another classic was that the Morrises would play classical music at full volume at 3:33 a.m. in the morning every single Wednesday. And when it was time for Sammy's exams, they escalated it to every day. My parents filed noise complaints, but the Morrises denied any involvement and, in fact, claimed that they hated classical music. And when investigators were there, somehow they mysteriously managed to know and the music didn't play on those nights. My eldest brother moved home and in no uncertain terms threatened the Morrises. The C words had the gall to call the cops on him, and this further undermined our claims against them. They went so far as to try and suggest that my brother was the one committing the vandalism, despite the fact that he'd been living in a totally different state during most of the incidents and had an alibi for most of it. Now Sammy, meanwhile, was becoming an absolute wreck, and we all felt so hopeless, and it felt like the whole world was against us. In the end, the entire family got together for a family meeting, and we very tearfully decided that the only recourse that we had was to move out of our family home that had been in the family since my mom's childhood. So that's what we did. We put the house up for sale, my parents accepted the first offer they received, and they moved into a smaller house that, realistically, was more manageable for them, especially once Sammy went away to college. There's no happy ending here, really, at least not for us. The lesson is simply that sometimes it's better to walk away than let your entire life be taken up with fighting the fight, even if it is a just and good one. There is an ending, though, but I can't say it's a good one, and as much as I hated the Morrises for what they put us through, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. Remember their son, who willingly went to military school and we nicknamed that Austrian painter? Well, it turns out that Augie had been thrown out of military school, then dishonorably discharged from the military, all without his parents' knowledge. He'd fallen into drugs and violence, and one day, he came home. Augie held his parents at gunpoint with a sawed-off shotgun, zip-tied them back-to-back to dining chairs, and then he and a couple of associates robbed the Morrises of every valuable they could get their hands on, and then, as a parting gift, with the butt of that sawed-off, he shattered both of his father's kneecaps. Nobody knows what caused Augie to hate his parents so much. It's probably not hard to guess, but when he was caught, he kept quiet. And he was caught a few days later as he admitted to what he'd done, but not why he'd done it. He was sent to prison for quite a few years, and Mrs. Morris died shortly after, poetically said to have died of a broken heart. Mr. Morris spent the rest of his years in a hospice, unable to walk, and also never uttered a single word again since that night. And so the new neighbors who bought our family home never had to deal with the neighbors from hell, and the whole story is a reminder of just how completely messed up and pointless the motivations of some people can be, how they can live with themselves when they all cause so much pain, and how when you cause pain to others, sometimes it returns to you tenfold. I don't know if I believe in karma, but in this case, I can't help but feel that no matter how much the Morrises screwed with my family, they got far more than they deserved, and I can only hope their son, Augie, can one day find some peace. So recently, I moved into an apartment block in a pretty artsy area of a pretty artsy neighborhood. Now, I won't dox myself, but you can probably guess one of two places I mean, and it's not the New York one. I love this apartment building. It was more of a boarding house, really. Only 8 apartments and the top floor belonging to the building super. And all the neighbors were really friendly, and most of us were artists of some sort. And there was me, a painter, and then we had a singer, a couple of writers, 2 more painters, and a mixed media artist, and apparently a sculptor. The sculptor was the neighbor directly across from me. Nobody knew his name, or even if he definitely was a he. He just went by the moniker TTT, all capital. The rest of us would often have sort of group brainstorm evenings where we'd chat about art and set the world to rights, in the common room or TV room that we all shared on the ground floor. Triple T never joined us, of course, and soon the mysterious sculptor became the subject of fascination for a group of creatives with hefty imaginations and too much time on our hands, obviously. Nearly all of the theories about TTT's true identity were ridiculous. Most of them were supernatural, and one of the painters absolutely swore that Triple T was Shia LaBeouf and claimed that she'd seen him when he moved in. And when we showed her a photo of Shia LaBeouf, though, she said it was the other Shia LaBeouf, and we could never quite work out what she actually meant by that. One of the writers decided that Triple T was a ghost, like in the movie Ghost, and that his sculptures were all clay pots and he was waiting for his Demi Moore to sit at the pottery wheel so he could finally create again. The singer claimed that Triple T was a beautiful woman whose face had been disfigured in a terrible car accident, which explained why some of her sculptures displayed in local galleries showed various figures in states of damage. Me, I just thought that Triple T was a reclusive sculptor who valued their privacy, and whenever TTT had a new sculpture to display, it would be found standing outside their apartment, and men in some suits from a certain gallery would come to collect it. Triple T always displayed at the same gallery, which I can't name for the same reason as not wanting to reveal myself. I did try knocking on Triple T's door a few times. Once or twice, I heard signs of life, and one time I was absolutely certain that I was being watched through a peephole. Just a gut feeling, but it did make me shiver. But if Triple T wasn't answering, I wasn't going to keep prying in there. And that's why it shocked me when, one Friday evening, I stepped out of my apartment ready to attend one of our weekly brainstorming sessions, only to see T's apartment door open a crack. Only darkness spilled from within, and I didn't want to enter without permission, so I just said, "Hello?" through the gap. No answer, although I was sure that I heard movement inside. The door was open. Someone could be in trouble, I thought. That was just sort of a justification enough to take a peek inside, right? And I turned on the flashlight app on my phone, but covered it with my palm just in case. And when I stepped inside, it was completely pitch black in there. I raised my phone, warning whoever was in there that I was about to light up the room, and then I slowly moved my hand away from the lens. I was not prepared for what I saw. The room was entirely bare. The walls and floor were sealed in plastic wrap, you know, the kind that they use in Dexter or some serial killer movies when they're about to kill someone in a room and don't want to leave blood splatter. And that wasn't the creepy part, though. The real creepy part was the statue that stood in the center of the room. It wasn't some kind of horror mannequin. It wasn't some horrific effigy of myself or anything else in the building. It was a classic-looking statue of the Holy Mother Mary, the kind that you find in a Catholic church. The only strange thing about her was that instead of a normal face, she'd been painted up to look like, of all things, a mime. I can't explain it, but I was absolutely certain that the statue was watching me. I was certain somehow that Triple T was the statue. The statue was Triple T. I took a tentative step forward and tapped the Mary statue. It was porcelain, and against my better judgment, I started to reach up and touch the face. It looked like flesh, and it looked so much like human flesh. My fingertips were less than an inch away, and I was about to touch it. I was about to touch TTT. And then I heard a noise in the room behind me. It was sort of like a muffled cry, like the word help. And I snatched my hand back from that statue and hurried to the door directly behind the statue. And it was the only door in the room. I grabbed the door handle and twisted it. The door was locked, but the moment I twisted the door open, I heard a loud, shattering crash behind me. Quickly whipping around, I saw the Mother Mary statue shattering and collapsing to the floor. I had no idea what to do. Had I just destroyed some priceless artifact? I walked up to that debris as carefully as I could, and the face was just laying there, and I'd been right. It was skin, sort of. It was a latex ball with Mary's face painted on it, and then a voice spoke from an unseen speaker somewhere in the room. "I am TTT. This is art. You are the art. Please leave." And so I left. I left and ran down the stairs and cursed myself a million times for not filming what I'd just seen. I told everyone what had happened, and we all rushed upstairs, but TTT's door was once again locked. And once again, I was certain that as we all stood there, someone was watching us through that peephole. And 2 days later, there was a small portable safe left outside of TTT's apartment, and the same guys in suits came to collect it. 2 days later after that, I received a gilded invitation in the mail to attend a private showing at Gallery Redacted before it opened to the public, and the invite was from Triple T themselves. Of course, I went, hoping to meet the reclusive sculptor. No such luck. Triple T's agent was there and informed me that Triple T's final piece was being unveiled that night. Unlike all their other pieces, it was a video. It was a video showing me entering the apartment, a black bar across my face to protect my identity. It showed me from various camera angles, cameras that must have been hidden in the walls, in the ceiling, and then it showed me from the perspective of Mother Mary's eyes. And for a second, just a few frames, the sensor bar disappeared and my face was replaced by that of a skull. And then it showed me rushing for the door, and here, the camera split into two joint shots, one showing me turning the doorknob, the other showed the statue trembling and collapsing, clearly triggered by some kind of mechanism in the door. Then the rest mostly played out how I described it. Except as I picked up Mother Mary's head, again the sensor bar disappeared from my face and this time briefly showed an angel, like a Greek sculpture. And the final shot of the video was simply text saying, "Life is clay, and you are all my sculpture. Goodbye, TTT." That was the only time the video was shown. I've tried to track down a copy for this last year. If anyone out there has any leads at all, please let me know in the comments. But holy crap, this was the creepiest and most bizarre thing to happen to me, and I am obsessed with getting a copy of this video. If anyone has any leads, anyone at all, please comment. I need to see it again. I need to understand why Triple T was trying to say this and what it says about me. All the other artists in the boarding houses have theories, and I'll leave you to make up your own. But there's one thing I've learned from all of this, one universal truth that speaks to us all in our very soul. Artists are freaking weird, man. Do any of you have someone who you'll never forget, even though you never really knew them that well? Someone who was a constant in your life, just sort of a background character who isn't around anymore. Someone you find your mind drifting back to every now and then because even though you didn't know them that much, you just saw them all the time and they were like an interactive, friendly part of the furniture. Now, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's like a beloved lazy boy that you get from Goodwill. You don't know its backstory and you never will, and you don't ask about its past and it doesn't ask about yours. Christ, this sounds dehumanizing, but it's how I think about it. It's in a fond, loving way, trust me, and I hope one day I'm someone else's Goodwill lazy boy, someone who touched a person's life just by being there and someone they'll always remember. Now, I remember Mr. Browning. I'll never forget him, and even though the last time I saw him was probably 1985, I think I remember him fondly regardless of how things ended. Now, I sure know that I always thought fondly whenever this guy crossed my mind. Me and the wife often talked about how we should invite him over for dinner. We wondered if he was lonely after his wife had passed a decade or so before, and we wondered if his adult kids called often because they never seemed to visit. But we just never got around to asking Mr. Browning. Hell, I don't even remember what his Christian name was. It was always, "Good morning, Mr. Browning," and he'd respond with, "Good morning, Ted." He was my elder. We understood the hierarchy, and I do know that he was a former teacher, so maybe he thought of himself as Mr. Browning. Maybe it didn't even cross his mind to ask me to call him by his first name. Amos, that was it. Amos Browning, and I remember from his obituary and later the funeral. And I think those were the only times that I heard his first name spoken, and one of the only times that I saw his adult children. His son was a very doughy-faced man who looked bored to be at his father's funeral. His daughter was one of those sharp-faced women with a meek, sycophantic husband and the kind of bratty son who wanted to be the center of attention, even at Grandpa's wake. We didn't stay long. We'd gone to pay our tributes to Mr. Browning, but we couldn't stay. We didn't want his family asking us questions about his death, and they likely knew that I'd been present when it happened, and I'm not a good liar. I would have struggled to give them the answers they wanted instead of the horrible, haunting, traumatizing truth. Me and Mr. Browning used to chat over the fence. Well, I'd lean over the fence and he'd mow the lawn, and he was always mowing his lawn. He had one of those old push mowers, an electric one, and I just kept trying to persuade him to buy a ride on, but he said his yard was way too small for that. It wasn't, and besides, at his age, probably early 70s, it was a great way to get some exercise and a little peace and quiet. Peace and quiet from who, I'm not really sure, since he lived alone after his wife had passed before me and my family moved in, but that's what he said. We'd talk, a lot, but never really get to know each other, you know. We talked about the Detroit Lions a bunch. He was a die-hard supporter, and I was just a pretty casual one. And we talked about the weather, we talked about politics, but never too seriously, and sometimes we'd watch the same shows at the same time, and we'd talk about those too. We both loved Miles Davis and The Who and Kiss, and he told me about his first ever concert, sneaking in to watch Kiss play, but I was never sure if he was telling the truth or just recounting the plot of that one movie where that exact thing happens. It was a fun story anyhow, even if he told me about 5 times, and occasionally he'd ask about my wife and how she was doing and how her job was going, but I think he wanted to talk about his wife in exchange but couldn't bring himself to do so, apart from that one time. Sometimes my wife would bring him a lasagna or some other baked goods, and he'd thank her like a perfect gentleman. And he always handed the dishes back to me over the fence, never once brought them to our door, always over the fence. Now, I chatted to him so much that by the time we moved out, there was a groove in the ground where grass had stopped growing in a place where I'd always stood to talk to Mr. Browning. Now, I remember exactly what we were talking about on the day it happened. My wife had just had a minor operation to remove a benign cyst from her breast, and he was asking how she was doing. I told him she was doing fine and would be home from the hospital the next day or even that evening if things went well. Mr. Browning looked at me then as he was mowing the lawn and then told me that I was lucky and I should hold on to a good woman like that. And then he said, and I'll never forget it, not least because they were his last words, he said, "I miss her so much." And then he sort of looked down, away, like he was about to hide tears, but I saw a look of alarm and then fear cross his face. Maybe I'm just imagining, but I swear that I saw him try and stop the forward motion of the mower as he pushed forward. I'm not sure how it happened. He was always so careful, running the electrical extension cable around the edge of the lawn, making sure that he was mowing nowhere near it, being careful like it was muscle memory. But I heard the crunch and whir of the motor running over the electrical socket and the cable. I don't know how or why, but there was no grounding. The mower's rubber handles just sort of weren't there anymore, and the live electrical cables got tangled into the motor blades, mangling and electrifying the mower as Mr. Browning held onto it. And hold onto it he did. I watched in abject frozen horror as his body began to convulse, as smoke rose up from his hands where he was gripping the metal handle. I could smell the cooking flesh and electrical burn. I watched as the grass around him singed and blackened, and I knew I had to knock him away from the mower but couldn't touch him myself. I searched for something, anything that I could safely use to shove him off the mower. My eyes settled on my old wooden baseball bat, but by the time I'd hauled myself over that fence, I knew it was too late. Mr. Browning had collapsed to the ground, finally letting go of the lawnmower, and I knew that there was no saving him, so I ran over to the outlet and switched off the electricity. Then I went back over to my neighbor, my friend who I knew so little about, and he was blackened and charred. His face was horrific. His eyeballs had somehow survived the electrocution, and they stared white and frozen out of a face that looked like it had been sucked clean from the inside. One detail I remember, one grim detail, is how his mouth was open and how I realized that he had false teeth because they had fallen down into his throat. I ran into his house and called 911, and the rest was a blur of paramedics and police and being questioned. And at first, when his daughter got there, she seemed to somehow blame me for her father's death, as if she'd ever given a crap about him in life. He may not have opened up to me, but Mr. Browning certainly made it clear that his kids did not play a big part in his life. And so fast forward to the funeral, the son gave a eulogy, and it was like he barely knew his father any better than I did. It made me so sad and devastated that this man who seemed like nothing but a nice, amicable gentleman could have been so forgotten and discarded, except for the neighbor who gave him some friendly, superficial banter over the fence, the same neighbor who was forced to watch him die. I swore then that when I had a kid, I would do everything I could to make sure that they wanted me in their life forever. And as it turned out, my wife was unknowingly pregnant at the time of that funeral. We had a son and then later 2 daughters, and they were the loves of my life. They're all grown themselves now with families of their own, and my wife and I are grandparents, and we make sure to keep our family close, regular meals together, Christmas and Thanksgiving being particularly huge affairs. Now, maybe Mr. Browning hadn't been a great father. It's not for me to judge his kids for distancing themselves from him. I don't judge them for their relationship with their father. It just sort of makes me sad. But before the sadness came the trauma. We bought our home with the intention of starting a family there, but every time I so much as stepped foot in the backyard, I was met with flashbacks of Mr. Browning cooking alive. I could smell that electric burn and see those bulging dead eyes. We made a loss selling, but we moved, and my son was born in a smaller house, but it was one filled with love and closeness, and I was no longer haunted by the sight of my neighbor's final moments, at least not directly. Like I said, I'll always remember Mr. Browning, and part of that means being cursed with remembering how I played witness to his demise.